We're back, people, and today we got another video going over the Miami Dolphins linebacker unit, and I just wanted to talk about the guys behind Jordyn Brooks and kind of how they fit into this defense and how it's a very interesting battle, and it basically comes down to three guys. Like, I think the off-ball linebacker unit is just a four-man unit. Pretty much everyone else is kind of irrelevant, maybe some practice squad players, but you got Jordyn Brooks, who's kind of the stud leader of that defense, had a really good season last year for Miami. I actually think like one of their better players on the team. Big fan of Jordyn Brooks and what he brings. I've done plenty of videos on him, so if you want to see those breakdowns, check those out. Leave a like, comment on the video, join as a member if you want early access to stuff and other fun benefits. But yeah, I think the first one to start with is Terrell Dodson. He's the one who is returning from last year. Dolphins picked him up around mid-season after cutting, David Long. They were able to find Dodson, who was released by the Seahawks. He was a starter for them. Came from the similar system with which Mike McDonald ran in Seattle. So he has that scheme experience, not just, coming from last year with Weaver, but even before that, he was running that same defense at the start of the year. So he has at least a year experience running a very similar system. He came to Miami and actually was pretty productive. I would say the only game where you got to see like his weaknesses shown off was that Green Bay Packers game. The entire defense kind of struggled, and that's kind of where like I see Dodson as. I actually think out of the unit on the back, after Brooks, he's the best cover guy, and it showed off with like at the coming into the team having 3 interceptions. That's a huge help. I love seeing a linebacker that can create some turnovers. I think he's a guy that does a pretty good job in coverage. He has a pretty good understanding of like leveraging route concepts, taking away throwing lanes, which is a big part of what Miami needs from their linebacker unit, especially when they're doing a lot of post-snap coverage rotations, getting to the right spot. And then Dodson, I think, has the athleticism and clearly, can make some plays when in the right spot. So that's kind of how I see Dodson. I think he's going to be the first guy and get the crack at the starting job, because I do think he can play as like a true off-ball linebacker. There are some inconsistencies he does have versus the run. I think he can make like the basic reads, but when it gets like complicated, like when they played the Packers do a lot of, pre-snap motioning. They do a lot of different stuff to make lives difficult on the linebackers with how they set up their runs, and it makes keys a little more difficult. And I think Dodson can get exposed in that area. And that's why, I see him as a guy that's going to be your starter number 2. But I do think the other 2 guys we're about to talk about will also see some playing time. But Dodson, in my opinion, is the best in like pure spot dropping zone of the 3 we're talking about. I think he's got good eyes and, will make some plays on ball. The other person that I want to talk about, the other 2 I think complement Dodson very well. But the one I think complements him super well is actually KJ Britt. KJ Britt is, I think, an underrated signing of the offseason. Dolphins added a lot of linebackers, him and Willie Gay, who we'll get to after Britt, that have different skill sets and, 1-year deals. KJ Britt's still pretty young as well, which I think is a nice bonus, cheap and young. And he's the opposite of Dodson. Pretty much gives you nothing in coverage. Britt is not much of a coverage guy. He can maybe make plays on like shallow crossers if it works into like the correct leverage, but he's not going to make any like splash or wow plays. He can play downhill. Like if the routes are throwing like underneath in front of him, he can play downhill and close. He's got good closing speed, but a very solid run defender, much better than Dodson. That's why I think you can see them complement their skill set. Certain games where like maybe Dodson's struggling versus the run. Hey, early downs, get KJ Britt out there. Later downs, swap in Dodson if that needs to be. It at least gives you something to work with. Yeah, you want a guy with a full-on skill set, but certain positions you just have to sacrifice that and, hope your depth and, rotation can help, complement the stuff that you sacrifice, because you went pretty cheap at linebacker. So you got to be able to make it up for guys that have very specific skill set, which Britt, I think, is a really quality run defender. He's really physical too. I think younger physical presence is always helpful. KJ Britt actually kind of gives me like a Landon Roberts vibes kind of player, where, you're not going to see much in coverage, but like he will fly downhill, read a run concept, shoot a gap, and, will hit someone if needed. And I don't mind that, taking that chance on Britt, even though he had some struggles last year for Tampa Bay. You could really see the good quality run defense stuff. And I think that's better than what they've had at their 3rd and 4th linebacker spots last year's and like in years prior, because their 3rd and 4th linebacker was usually someone who wasn't great at really anything. At least KJ Britt is pretty great in one category. It's the other ones where like you could see him being exposed, but it's not like, like usually in the past was like a Duke Riley who, had his moments of playing decent, but I wouldn't say he had any area where I thought of him as being great, other than maybe like his straight line speed, but I don't think that's that important playing linebacker. I prefer more instincts, lateral movement, being able to play like in between the box. That's where KJ Britt thrives, and that's sort of how I see him fitting in the defense, playing in a pretty rundown specific role, and I think that can bring some value, especially in certain matchups. There might be games where you don't see him play much or, not at all. And there'll be games where like, hey, this team is run heavy first, get KJ Britt out there. Maybe they run more base than usual. And that's kind of where I think, base and, being in more specific packages. This is when you get to Willie Gay, who's kind of the mix of the group. He's got a little bit of everything in his skill set, kind of jack of all trades, but master of none, kind of struggles in certain areas that I don't think will make him a starter, because I think some people might pencil him in as like the starter next to Jordyn Brooks. Personally, I don't think that's the best idea for him. I think he's the guy that should be like the third linebacker and comes in and plays all over the field. Like you can play him as an edge defender. He's very good rushing the passer, which is helpful. Jordyn Brooks is really a blitzer. If you want to bring Willie Gay as a blitzer, he's got that very good speed. Like he flies around the field. But I think that's where he's like, you got to just allow him to play downhill. You don't want him to have to like read his keys. Like when linebackers are playing like true off ball, and Dolphins are typically, they have like 4 down in the front, maybe 2 linebackers, 5 DBs. The 2 off ball linebackers, you got to make your reads. You have to be able to work off defensive tackles, read pullers, understand the flow of plays, be able to, peel back off, scrape, get, understand your responsibilities and fits. I think that's where Gay can kind of struggle, not always play consistent in those areas. And that's why I'm like, you want him more in that role that's a little less defined as a true off ball, where he doesn't have to make those reads. Allow him to just fly downhill. Put him up to match up. I think he's got good man-to-man ability. You want to match him up man-to-man on running backs, he can do that. He's more of a less thinking type of linebacker. Let his athleticism shine. Put him in advantageous positions where he doesn't have to think as much. And that's where like he can make the best plays of this group for sure. Like definitely have some faith when it comes to Willie Gay in that facet. Not as like a true off ball, but like he can play edge. He can play as the overhang. You can even see him bump out and play as like a linebacker that's almost aligned as like a nickel at times. Allow him to blitz, use him in those fun, different ways. I think that's where Weaver's going to find some value out of him. If you go and watch like the Ravens defense, he's not going to play as like a Roquan Smith or Patrick Queen. But when you watch them and they allowed Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen to like play aggressive downhill in those packages, that's where you can get that out of Willie Gay, because he has that type of athleticism. Maybe not the full on. I actually think he's like, some people might think of him as a Will run and chase guy. I actually think he plays as more of a Sam, because even though he's not, he actually is pretty willing and physical, takes on blocks decently well. Kind of just put him in front of someone and I think, tell him, hey, that's your guy, and he can make some good plays there. He's very high energy too, high motor, which is also nice. Also a guy that they got pretty cheap, not super old either. So, another guy that kind of fits in that rotation. I would love to upgrade at the linebacker 2 spot next to Brooks, but I think for a position that they didn't really put much assets into, they actually upgraded compared to the start of last season. David Long obviously was an affiliate. I think Dotson's already an upgrade over that, and I think Britt and Willie Gay are definitely an upgrade over depth-wise at the linebacker position. So while you didn't like drastically improved, I think you just kind of improved across the board at each spot, and you have guys that sort of just fit into each role pretty nicely. If you can combine them all, if you can combine all their best traits into one player, you'd have an elite linebacker. It's just unfortunate you kind of have to break it off into 3. So that'll be down to Weaver to, get them on the field at the right time. Same thing with the linebackers coach, the off-ball, linebacker group, because the edge is a little bit different, even though, Willie Gay can do a little bit of that stuff. And that's kind of how I see it, with the roster. I don't think you need, I think Channing Tindall's time personally has come to an end. Unless he really breaks out this offseason, which I don't think I see happening. If you maybe practice squad, but I just think based on the defense and the roster and the numbers, you should only keep 4 in that group, and it's Jordyn Brooks, Terrell Dodson, Willie Gay Jr., and KJ Britt. The other guys, there's not even really that many people in the room. The other off-ball linebackers are Eugene Asante, who's in the UDFA, Jackson Daquan, and then Channing Tindall. And Tindall's really the only one out of that group that's made the roster in the past, and he really has to show up, I think, to kind of potentially keep his spot. He has to really outperform those guys. And honestly, I think those 4 are
fairly locked to make the roster unless Tyndall surprises, which I don't see happening. So if you guys enjoyed the video, comment and subscribe. Peace.